Welcome to the Enlightenment Podcast to our listeners and viewers around the world. In these pivotal times, it's vital, we feel, to engage in a meaningful dialogue about Palestine, to provide a deeper insight and context that we feel is often missing from mainstream media, and to highlight Palestine's rich traditions, rich history and culture. Today, we are joined by Dr. Ghada Karmi to explore Palestine's history, the quest for a just solution and the right of return. Dr. Ghada, welcome.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Hello.
Dr. Ghada Karmi is a Palestinian-born academic, physician, prolific author, and activist. She was an associate fellow at the Royal Institute of International Affairs in London and was a visiting professor at London Metropolitan University and was also vice chair of the Council for Arab-British Understanding, also known as CAABU.
Ahlan, Dr. Ghada, welcome. You had a career in medicine and then you shifted into political activism and writing. So what influenced that pivot and what shaped your decision to focus on activism and writing?
Yes, I'll tell you, it was an event, 1967. The 1967 war was really the event that catapulted me into Palestinian activism. Not unlike Edward Said, who has a very similar experience. He also was not active until 1967. Now, I had been brought up in a Palestinian home, even though it was in London, and my mother kept up all the customs, the food, the music, everything. Everything was very much as if we had never left Jerusalem. Now, because of my parents' traumatic experience of expulsion, of losing their home, my father in particular, was terribly anxious that we, his children, should make our way in the world and ensure our own survival, our jobs, our futures, without getting involved in politics. He was afraid that if we started to become activists, we would neglect our education. And he was very anxious, and I understand it as a parent, as a man who knew what it was like to be uprooted and lose your home and your homeland. He wanted us to be secure, at least financially secure. And he saw that coming from a decent education and a decent training. Hence my medical education, for example, my brother as an engineer, my sister who became a chemist. So, that was the thinking behind that. And so I grew up in childhood in London and then went to school and went to university, very much with the issue of Palestine somewhere at the back of my mind. It was never something that my parents brought forward, or as such was their fear that we would all get sidetracked into some kind of political activity. But the 1967 changed all that. There was no way I could have escaped the realization, the understanding that I'm actually Palestinian. I am not some kind of strange creature that goes to school and goes to university and gets degrees. In 1967, I had a terribly shocking experience. I've written about it in my memoir, In Search of Fatima, in which I had colleagues and friends. I was newly qualified. I was a young doctor working at a hospital, and my colleagues and friends were mainly English. And then the war started, and it's a kind of scene that I will never forget. I walked into what we called the doctor's mess. That is a kind of place where doctors relaxed, and we had a TV and food and tea making and coffee making. Anyway, I walked in, and there was on the TV was we were watching the Israeli army entering into Arab countries, etc. And these colleagues and friends were clapping and saying, "Oh, good on you, Israel. Yeah, come on, give it to them. I can't believe it. I thought, don't they understand that I I am one of the people who are being bombed and killed and, you know. Anyway, to cut a long story short, that set me on a path and from which I never returned, that I began to understand I was not some ordinary person about their business and their education, that I was somebody who was Palestinian, who had a cause, and I would fight for my cause. That's how it began.
As a storyteller, I'm very much about the power of words and storytelling. And your book, you mentioned In Search of Fatima, a Palestinian Story. You talk about growing up in Jerusalem. So can you tell me, did you always want to be a writer as well as I know you went into medicine for those reasons. What drove you to write the book, and what are its themes?
Well, I had always been interested in literature, in stories. In fact, my mother used to say when my father insisted that I should go to medical school, I remember my mother saying to him, "Leave her alone. She tells stories." And it was just kind of known about me. Sadly for me, I have to tell you, I didn't get a chance because medicine is very demanding. You can't do medicine and become a novelist or become, and I tried to get out of becoming a doctor. And that was one of my reasons. I knew temperamentally I was much more suited to writing stories, exactly what my mother had said, but I didn't get a chance. So my writing career didn't start for a very long time. It's very delayed because of being a doctor. And anybody knows, watching this, that being a doctor is a full-time job. If your work, you can't do it and something else, not really. And so that's what happened. It was only when I left what we would call hospital medicine that I started to get some time to myself. And late in life, as I say, I started my writing. And the first book which was published, was indeed In Search of Fatima, which is a memoir.
A memoir of your life, just for people who haven't read it.
Indeed.
Yeah.
It was a memoir of my life, having started off in Jerusalem, then continuing in London.
Wonderful.
And it did very well as well. So for those who haven't read it, please do. And the propaganda of a land without a people for a people without a land is a narrative aimed at erasing centuries of Palestinian culture and history, which I mentioned a bit earlier. And in your book, Married to Another Man, you refer to two rabbis as early as, I think, 1897, who visited Palestine as settler colonialists and observed that there was a bride who was, quote, beautiful, but married to another man. So could you please discuss how your book counters this propaganda of a land without a people and what you covered in it?
Well, I wouldn't see it as countering because it is so absurd. The idea that Palestine was empty is so transparently a propaganda ploy and a fantasy. It is extremely, to take it seriously would have given it some kind of credibility. And I wouldn't dream of doing that. So basically, I wrote that book, Married to Another Man. As you quite rightly say, it's derived from that story, which I think is apocryphal. You see, the rabbis, by the way, were dispatched by the First Zionist Congress, which decided on Palestine. They dispatched the rabbis because they didn't know anything about Palestine. That's what is so ludicrous about this whole project. They sent them to say, what is this place, Palestine? And these rabbis were from Vienna. So they went, and as you say, they found the place was full of people, not Jews, other people, and hence they wrote back that telegram. No, I wouldn't dream of countering this propaganda, but certainly the book, in talking about the Palestinians and what was happening, and Zionism and how it affected the Palestinians, so on. Of course, it's very clear that we're talking about a populated country, and the population is Palestinians. So that's my answer to that.
Great. So since Israel started, it started as a settler colony for sure. People came, and the existing Palestinian population was violently dispossessed. They were systematically expelled. There was this destruction, this sort of ethnic cleansing that we now recognize. And there were massacres that started from the early 1920s, long before the Zionist colony of Israel was actually created, and is now culminating in a new genocide on Gaza. But despite all this evidence and documentation of this 100-year history now of atrocities and massacres of Palestine, many people still dismiss these facts. Can you tell us a little bit about this historic, brutal history and its impact on the Palestinian people, because it's not well covered?
Yeah, look, the Zionist aim was perfectly clear and perfectly simple. It was to take over the land of Palestine minus its people. That's the aim. So all their actions are explained in those terms. One doesn't have to be a political genius to work out that everything they did was aimed at emptying the land in order to create a state for Jews. So that's what it was. Now, in terms of the massacres, there were many massacres particularly of villages, of villagers, aiming to not only expel the people of that particular village, but encouraging other villagers who presumably would be terrified by seeing what was happening and leave of their own accord. And it worked to a certain extent. Very important massacre, the Deir Yassin massacre, which took place early in 1948, was precisely designed to do that. This Deir Yassin was a village outside Jerusalem, and the Zionist militias arrived there and killed a lot of people. The exact number is disputed. It's something upper limit of 250, and lower is a sort of 110, something like that. But it doesn't really, it's not the point, the numbers. It was horrific. And what the Zionists did is, after that massacre, they got jeeps to go around Jerusalem, the streets of Jerusalem, and say, you know what happened to Deir Yassin? Well, you're next. And it was very effective, because after all, most people are civilians. They're not politicians. They're not experienced military experts. They think of their families. They think of their children. So they thought, and our family was precisely like that. They thought that in order to keep us children safe, that what they would do would be to leave our home in Jerusalem temporarily. That's the point, that so many Palestinians who were frightened into leaving did so with the belief that it would be temporary, that maybe a couple of weeks. In our case, my mother said, I remember my mother saying, now, we can't have this, we can't take that, because we're not going to be away for long. And that was the way people thought. We did not understand that what we had was an absolutely implacable enemy that was determined to empty the land. And when people left, they would make sure that they were never, ever allowed to return. And that's what happened.
Yeah. And just to add to what you said, Ghada, these massacres not only started in 1947, 48, but they were throughout the 20s, 30s, and so on. And they're all very well documented. And they culminated into 47, 48, even before the British left. And oftentimes in villages, they would surround the village, keep, like, there'd be 4 entrances, they'd keep one entrance open while they're attacking the others to force people to flee. And in some cases, like Lid and others, they actually surrounded it and did horrendous massacres. So it was, forceful expelling, and not sort of, as a lot of people say, it was the prerogative of Palestinians to leave, therefore it's too bad for them, that kind of thing.
No, and I would hate for people to interpret what I've just said as meaning that these massacres just occurred in 48. Of course not. They were, as you say, quite rightly, they started early on because the policy was there early on.
In 1947, when the UN voted to partition Palestine, there were only 33 colonial powers who made that decision without permission, without consent from Palestinians or the Arab neighbor countries. But at the time, in 1948, the Jewish population had grown to only 30%, and the vast majority only arrived 3 years earlier. And despite the attempt of the Zionists from the sort of the turn of the century, 19th century onwards, to buy land as much as possible, they were, by 48, they only owned 6 or 7% of historic Palestine, and yet they were assigned 56% of Palestine. So, and the plan of the UN was never really implemented, and they end up stealing 78% of Palestine. And again, we saw in 1967, as you mentioned, which pivoted you and Edward Said, the settler colony of Israel went to war and illegally occupied the rest of Palestine with, again, pushing over 300,000 Palestinians, which we call the Naksa, plus the 750,000 over in the Nakba. So can you talk about this Zionist strategy and the focus on ethnic cleansing and the land theft and appropriation? Because people now are saying, well, it was never their strategy, but we've seen it again and again. It's a continuum, if you like, of their policy and strategy.
No, I think if people are in doubt about this, then they need to do some reading. They need to understand what Zionism is. It was never a secret. This is the aspect of this whole story which is so terrifying. It was never a secret. What the Zionists wanted and what they intended was known right from the very start. It was known to the British colonialists who ruled Palestine from 1917 onwards. It was extremely well known. Everybody knew it. The Zionist idea was that they believed that the way to solve the problem of persecution of Jews, which was a phenomenon of Europe, which was a European phenomenon, and that the way to resolve it would be to create a space in which Jews would live as a majority. That is Zionism. And unfortunately for Palestinians, they decided when they were looking for somewhere to establish a state for Jews, we mustn't forget that other possibilities were considered. Land in Uganda that the British would have made available because they were the colonial power there. There was land in South America. It wasn't necessary at the beginning that it had to be Palestine. The problem was that the early Zionists discovered something very important. They realized that if you created a state for Jews in Brazil, let's say, Argentina, who's going to go there? Jews are not going to get themselves out of there where they live and go all the way to that. So they hit on the fact that if you used Palestine with all the connections, contacts, allusions to the Bible and the Old Testament, then Jews would be attracted to come. But what is more important, that the colonial powers, the Western powers, which would protect the new state, were themselves influenced by the Old Testament. So it was a very, very important decision on the part of the Zionists. Now, when one knows that, therefore, everything that happens is entirely logical. There's nothing mysterious about it. So it was from the very beginning, these Europeans, which is what they are, let's call them what they are. They are Europeans, Jews, who wanted to create a safe haven for other Jews were very clear that if they wanted Palestine, Palestine was full of people. So the only way forward was to get rid of the people. And that's what's been happening ever since.
Yeah. And you've talked, we just talked about this now, expelling everybody quite forcibly. But there's also this world of where then, of course, the Palestinian presence is naturally erased after that. You don't want the people, you probably do not want the culture. So towns got renamed, villages and homes are destroyed. Settlers and settlements have been built on top of that destruction. But despite that, as you say, it's very clear, it's very open. It seems like the Zionist Hasbara, the propaganda has been extremely successful because people can't imagine that if it's that clear, it would be happening. So can you tell us a little about, you mentioned that people should read about it if they're in any doubt. There are definitely history books by Palestinians and Israelis and others that will talk about this. But your book, In Search of Fatima, how does this touch on some of these themes and what would people get from that?
Well, I hoped very much that through my book, which is a personal account about a family and what happened to them, would be in microcosm, would illustrate what happened in macrocosm. So that people would, through the medium of a personal story, would begin to understand what was going on in Palestine and how Israel came to be and what Israel did. And now I've been very relieved and gratified, I must tell you, by the fact that many people who read In Search of Fatima got the message. They understood. Through the personal narrative, they understood what really was going on. And, it's one of the nicest things that could have happened to me as a writer when I had young people writing, telling me, we didn't know. And these are often Palestinians. These were Palestinians who said, we just didn't know how it was. So there's that medium. But I would say that people really ought to read Jewish writers on this subject, because I really do think they have a very special expertise. And two of the people who occur to me is Ilan Pappé, first of all, who wrote a really outstanding book called The Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine. And that explains so much about the Zionists, what they were doing, and how they got rid of the Palestinian people, the ethnic cleansing of Palestine. There was also a British Jewish writer called John Rose, who wrote a book called The Myths of Zionism. That is a short book, small book, which is, I think, excellent. It explains the whole thing. Another writer that people might want to look at would be Avi Shlaim, Shlaim, who is an Israeli Jewish, another Jewish Israeli beside Ilan Pappé, who has written things about the Balfour Declaration and the way that Palestine was given away. So I think it would be very useful to look at those books.
Absolutely. Thank you. And we did a podcast with Avi. So anyone who hasn't seen it, please listen to it. It's really fascinating and eye-opening. And I agree with you. I think a lot of people sadly don't listen to Palestinian voices, and they tend to believe more the narrative if it comes from Israeli Jews or Jewish people in the West. But these are very good recommendations. Thank you. And then Palestinians have endured decades of brutal and cruel and inhumane oppression, as we talked about, and the illegal Israeli occupation. And yet we haven't been crushed. You mentioned your father was traumatized, so were my family, to focus on not going to politics, not to become activists, and so on. But 77 years on, the world is finally seeing that oppressing millions of people by force and expecting them not to resist will never work. We've seen it in history, in other cultures, with other settler colonial brutal regimes. Could you discuss why Palestinians continue to resist and the futility of really expecting them to submit and also to just roll over and do what they're told?
Yeah, I mean, you're quite right. People who have been oppressed and who continue to be oppressed will resist. It's unless you kill them all, which happened with the Native Americans, where most of them were obliterated, really, by the white settlers from England and elsewhere from Europe. Unless you really kill them all, they will immediately resist, and it is something which is not only inherent in the human condition, but interesting enough, was noted on by a very well-known Zionist, a man called Vladimir Jabotinsky, who was writing in the 1920s. He was the, I suppose, the founder of right-wing Zionism, which later became Likud, etc. Now, this Jabotinsky wrote a most outstanding essay called The Iron Wall, in which you can find it. It's not difficult to find, in which he sets out quite clearly. He says, addressing other Zionists, of course, he's saying, look here, if you want to go through with this, in other words, you want to go on with this Zionist project, you need to be aware that the natives will resist you, and they will continue to resist. They will never, ever accept you. So his advice was very clear. He said, either expect to go on fighting against this resistance always, or give up on the project now. I mean, I'm paraphrasing this, but that's the message. And he was absolutely right. He was right. Not just Palestinians, everybody in that situation will always resist. It's part of being human.
Yeah. On that note, let's talk about Gaza, because one of the reasons that Hanan and I were inspired to start this podcast was the level of dehumanization that we were feeling and it became very obvious, I guess, in the face of everything that was going on, this carpet bombing of civilians. For us, we feel very strongly that Western media, legacy media in general, has a bit of an outdated colonial bias, and the tragedy of Gaza and Palestine is a failure of journalism to let people know exactly what's going on. Do you believe that legacy media outlets play a big role in perpetuating this misinformation, and what is the effect on Gaza, on Palestine?
I do think so, yes. You see, I think this genocide would not have gone on for long if the mass media had been on side. In other words, they had taken up a position in which they showed it like it is. They commented on it, they invited analysis and commentary on the inhumanity of these actions on the part of Israel. I truly think that the genocide would have ended far, far sooner.
Mm.
The sad aspect of this terrible story is that the media decided to go along with the Zionist narrative. They, you can see it in a million ways. On the one hand, they didn't cover what was really happening to the Palestinians. Now, of course, their argument was that Israel did not allow for journalists to enter into Gaza. But to my mind, what that should have provoked is a mass movement from the media, from the journalists, to say, where on earth does it happen that a war is taking place, and and journalists are not allowed in. How is this possible? They could have made such a fuss about this that Israel's hand would have been forced. The media played a crucial role in this genocide by shielding Israel from criticism, by not demanding to have their journalists in to be able to do their jobs properly, and by not protesting against the killing of journalists.
Mm-hmm.
We know that Israel has killed a huge number of journalists, most of them Palestinians, but not entirely, but not only. That should have been in itself a cause of outrage and protest on the part of the mass of journalists. It is, no question, a terrible, cowardly, abject failure on the part of the media not to convey the truth of what was happening and what has been happening in Gaza. But you see, that leads me on to what I think is a really, really important question, which is, let's just go back to the earlier point. Clearly, once you have colluded in the dehumanization of a group, in which whatever happens to them doesn't really matter that much, when you've actually created an environment of this kind, you, apart from this being something which is utterly unacceptable, but you've enabled Israel to continue with its brutality and with its genocide, which leads me to a really important question that I think people need to be discussing night and day, which is what is behind the impunity of Israel to behave in this way? You see, put it another way, I often use this analogy. You have a psychopathic killer down your street, okay? And this psychopathic killer will go around knifing people and killing people and strangling people. And the police are standing by and allowing the psychopathic killer to go around and kill your children, kill whoever. The question then becomes not about the psychopathic killer. He is a psychopathic killer. It's no point saying, oh dear, why is he a psychopathic killer? You need to ask the police, what is this? Why is the police standing by and letting this happen? And that, I think, is the really crucial question for all of us. And we need to raise it very loudly, very clearly, and we need to analyze it, discuss it, and we need to demand answers from the people, the establishments, the people in power. Why are you allowing Israel to do this?
Yeah.
Why? What's behind this?
Exactly. And the media, as you say, they perpetuated this sort of narrative of the oppressors, and they still do that, sadly, even despite the genocide. And they haven't stood up to speak out against their fellow journalists being killed in such, and murdered in such brutal ways. But people in the global majority, if you like, are finding out the truth about the settler colony of Israel because of the horrific genocide on Gaza. But despite the devastation, the brutal destruction of Gaza, we see Palestinians returning on foot to rubble to rebuild their lives, and the sumud of the Palestinians is truly inspiring and incredible. But to this day, the settler colony of Israel has never defined or established legal and binding borders. They continue to illegally expand their borders into Lebanon, Syria, of course, Palestine, and so on. So what are your thoughts on this ongoing illegal territorial expansion and also this US Riviera project that which is really continuing this pattern of displacement, ethnic cleansing, which we know is a crime against humanity that violates international law?
Well, look, I don't think it's very, very difficult to understand Israel. This is a chance in a lifetime. They could never have ever dreamt of being allowed to behave in this way, of having, first of all, Joe Biden, who would have rolled over and whatever they wanted, So that was one. And now you've got Trump, who is carrying on apparently the same tradition. They couldn't have dreamt ever in their wildest dreams that they could have an opportunity like this. So what they're doing, I think, is making as much of the opportunity as they can before things change. So hence the aggression towards all their neighbors, the expansionism, and as you point out, they've never defined their borders. Oh, no, of course not. Because if you want to expand, which is what they're obviously wanting to do and what they are doing, you don't define your borders. So that's the reason. And of course, they're doing whatever they can, grabbing whatever they can, before, as they anticipate, something happens in which this killing spree will come to an end. So I think that's where that is, where that's concerned. In terms of Trump's ridiculous idea of turning Gaza into a Riviera or something, it's sort of part and parcel of Trump's rather outrageous pronouncements and behavior. I don't know how seriously one can take this. I think it's absurd and it won't happen because of precisely the other thing you mentioned quite rightly. The people of Gaza would rather die on the spot in Gaza than be driven out. They've learned the lessons of history. They know very well that if they were ever made compelled to leave their land, they will never return. They know that. So they are impelled to stay, no matter what the cost. And that, of course, leads me on to a comment which is really something for us to think about. The people of Gaza have set up new standards of behavior for the whole world. I cannot think of a comparable example of a small people so resistant, so full of determination not to be obliterated, not to leave their country, and in an odd way, but I think obviously clear to viewers, Israel, in a way, did the Gaza Palestinians a favor in this sense. And I tell you what I mean. Because of the Israeli withdrawal from Gaza in 2005, although, of course, Gaza was besieged and was subject to tremendous hardships, nevertheless, they are in touch with each other. And hence, they form a cohesive, a cooperative society. That's what keeps resistance going. You look at the West Bank tragically, where Israel was allowed to divide the West Bank and parcel it up into little villages and towns and things like that, all separated by barricades and by checkpoints. It's very difficult for a proper resistance movement to arise in circumstances like that.
Yeah, and as you say, for audience who don't know, around 80% of Palestinians in Gaza are already refugees twice over. So they've learned, as you said, Ghada, they've in 48, 67, and in the 50s as well. They expelled even Palestinians from supposedly Israel proper into Gaza. So it's they've learned their lesson. They've seen what's happened to them.
Absolutely. And it's made them determined they are never going to leave. That's the point. And it really, it would be really a case of over my dead body, really, for the people of Gaza.
Tragically. But, you said that's such a wonderful, it's with the way you described it is like it's almost heroic. So, it's and certainly it is not being appreciated as such. And often this dehumanization of Palestinians is still going. What is needed to change that narrative and that perception?
Well, in a way, I'm very tempted to say to you, I don't know, because it's gone so far and so deep. And remember, of course, it's also an aspect of white supremacist, racist thinking. That's where they meet. So Zionism meets this ideology head on, and they work together. So that dehumanization, of course, is key, because it was the key to the way that the colonies, the initial classic colonies of the 19th century, earlier, later, were set up. Western colonies dominated by white people who regarded the native populations as less than human, and killed them at will, brought them diseases. This is very, very entrenched in Western thinking. It really is. And it's worth saying that not only, as you point out quite rightly, is this heroic Gaza people, how they've fought to keep their lives and their lands. Not only is that heroic, but the other aspect of it, which is very fascinating and is being played out before our very eyes, is the way they have unmasked what's been going on, the way that the whole world has been upended. Since when did we think that we would be talking in these terms? About colonialism, about dehumanization, about brutality, we're doing this because of the actions of the resistance in Gaza. That we have to face that. And part of the contempt, dehumanization, racism against the Palestinians is the way that the resistance movement, their resistance movement, Hamas, Islamic Jihad, these are designated, quote, terrorist organizations. Secondly, they are ostracized. You hear it all the time, that in any future deal over the governance of Gaza, Hamas must have no role to play. Well, who are these people who are telling the inhabitants of Gaza who shall represent them and who shall not? And why is it somehow assumed? And I've often said this, because it's ridiculous, the way that Hamas is treated, the way it's talked about over on the Western side of the world, is as if these were a people who came down from Mars. They landed from Mars in spaceships, and they took up this fighting, and they started killing people because they're all Martians. So it's a bit like that. There's no recognition. These are Palestinians also. They have a political movement called Hamas, and that the political movement has a military arm.
Yeah, and this demasking that you talk about has become a sort of, there's a growing number of Jewish people in the West who are now finding out and distancing themselves from this racist, ethno-supremacist Zionist project, because they're finding out more and more that there's a huge disconnect between Judaism as a religion and Zionism as an ethno-supremacist project and ideology. But the Zionist settler colony of Israel still insists that and claims they represent all Jews everywhere in the world. Can you discuss your views on this?
Well, look, it's part of the genius of Zionism was precisely that, the blurring of what was a political movement with a religion. They did that right from the beginning because they knew the winning card was not the political movement, it was the religion. And hence, that's the way they attracted Jews who were going about their business and trying to live their lives. That's the way they got them to, in a sense, de-assimilate so that they could acquire a loyalty to a new so-called Jewish state. It's the essence of Zionism. They cannot do without it because it would end. That would end the movement, really. And they're not going to give up on it. On the contrary, they reinforce it. Now, one of the things along exactly in that trajectory that they started, which is absolutely another act of genius, is to equate anti-Zionism with anti-Semitism. So as a result, people are either confused or nervous to say anything about Israel in case they're told that they hate Jews, which is what anti-Semitism is. Now, being against Israel is perfectly valid because this is a state. Zionism is a state ideology. It's a political movement. You can have whatever view you want on it. What you can't do is say that Jews as a collective are horrible or like whatever, something insulting. That's not on. And as I say, it was a stroke of genius to equate the two. As a result, people are in a terrible state. They don't know, they don't say anything, and they don't criticize Israel. So Israel cannot afford to distinguish itself from Judaism. It just cannot. It would not last. It would lose. Now, Jewish, I'm very encouraged by the phenomenon of more and more Jews who live in different Western countries and who are part of those countries, by the way. I must avoid this idea that there's something called the Jews. There really isn't. There are people, and some of them are Jewish and others are Christian and so on and other. Now, that a lot of people who had presumably identified as supporters of Israel, these are Jews, who now no longer wish to be identified with a state that behaves in this way. It's very encouraging that this movement is growing, and of course, in its own way, is a very great threat to the state of Israel, because Israel depends and relies on, as you will well know, on the support of Jews, Jewish money, Jewish influence, in Western countries. And if that starts to unravel, then they're really in deep trouble.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, go ahead. I was just going to say, I feel like that there's sort of been this creation of an ethno-supremacy, which really is a construct, and it has to be dismantled, because the practices that are of apartheid, particularly. My parents are from South Africa, and I think this is much more brutal in many ways. The separation of anybody who's not Jewish, even if you're nominally an Israeli citizen, you get treated very differently. And if you are a Palestinian of any kind living in Israel, you get treated very differently. B'Tselem in Israel, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International have all reported on this. But I think, as you say, people everywhere feel this injustice, and it feels like over the last year, Palestinian oppression has become everybody's oppression and feeling of needing to have a sense of justice. How can any activists out there continue to support Palestinian rights and keep this momentum? Because, as you say, it's not happening at the news level or at the government level yet. What can ordinary people do?
Well, it's very good that you asked this question, because one of the issues that has been bothering me a lot is how to harness the support shown by ordinary people, or in so many countries, global. Really, this is a global movement. Yeah. How do you harness that kind of momentum and make it useful so that it feeds into the center of power, into the centers of power? This is a debate that really has got to be discussed very seriously, especially among all the people who head up solidarity movements. They need to get together because, a lot of this sympathy is expressed through membership of various solidarity groups in different countries. Now, those solidarity groups, in my opinion, their directors, their heads, their leaders have to get together and have this debate What are we going to do? What's the next step on from the, demonstrating, etc. So that's a very important issue. And, in a way, I suppose this feeds into the next issue, which is, what about the future? How are we going to get out of all this, Now, I'll tell you, before the genocide, before October 2023, I had published a book called One State, and the subtitle was The Only Democratic Future for Palestine-Israel. Now, I wrote it in a conviction, which I have had for a very long time, that there really is no future in two states, in confederations, in federations, etc., because at the heart of the issue is the dispossession of the Palestinian people. Unless that is addressed, nothing will last. There is no future. So I started my thoughts from that point. Palestinians have been dispossessed unfairly, unjustly, illegally. They are living, some of them are living under direct Israeli rule. A lot are living in camps or in exile, people like me. All these people need to go home. They need to go back to their homeland. So if one started off from that point, not from what do we do about Jewish Israelis and what about this and how do we share this? If we start off from that point, it becomes absolutely clear that the only way that dispossession will end is with the dismantlement of the current apartheid racist state of Israel. There is no other way to do this, none. Therefore, you have to work on, with that aim in mind, that the current state of Israel cannot go on as it is and must change and be transformed into a proper democracy, which means that the Palestinians living there and the Palestinians who are going to go home enjoy equal citizenship with everybody else. So the Jewish Israelis, are currently called Jewish Israelis, would have equal citizenship with Palestinian Arabs. So the whole thing would be within a democratic framework, and then obviously it's very difficult and there are many issues to be resolved, but that is the structure through which ultimately the whole issue will be resolved.
I agree. And I think this whole two-state farce has been a farce from the beginning, just to give them time to steal more land and to implement their plan. And I agree, a single democratic decolonized state from the river to the sea, irrespective of religion, ethnicity, with equal rights to all, as you say, but also with justice, reparation is very important. And of course, the right of return of all Palestinians, which is recognized under international law. All these are really important. I know you mentioned your book, One State, The Only Democratic Future of Palestine-Israel, that you touched on that. But I think it's now become even more important since the genocide on Gaza. Do you think we'll realize this vision in our lifetime? And how can we accelerate that vision, if you like?
Good. Okay, good question. Good question. Because, of course, since October 2023, and since the horrors that we've seen, and since the mask fell from Israel, which has been shown to be a brutal monster, you can't really ask decent human beings, Palestinian Arabs or Jewish Israelis who share the same values, you cannot ask these poor people who have suffered so much to live with the killers, with the monsters. You can't do it. By the way, and nor can they. On the other hand, nor will the Jewish Israelis who regard the Palestinians as subhuman. They don't want to be living with these subhumans. So I think this will make it there is no prospect, I think, of having this happen in the short term. It cannot. But ultimately, you see, and this is a very important point I always try to make, ultimately, that is the only destination. So without being prescriptive and saying, by the year so-and-so, and this will take 3 years, and no, we cannot say that. But what we can say is that is the only ultimate destination that will cure this disease, the disease of Zionism.
Yeah.
That is the only way that we can imagine a future for those people. But let's face it, we didn't create Israel. We Palestinians would never have created such a thing. Those who created it are the culprits, are the murderers. And it's been left for us to solve it. This is what is so sad. But yet it's a duty we can't shirk, because we as Palestinians, and I very much believe and hold and would say that we are, never mind our enemies, we ourselves, we are human, and we respect human life, and we know how to live with other people. Therefore, that's what we're going to have to try and do.
Yeah. What difference do you hope to make personally to have the most impact when it comes to Palestine?
What a question. I think this should be our last.
Okay, fair.
Look, I don't know that, anybody can make an impact in the sense that you mean, but I've always hoped that what I write, what I say, where it has been possible to do it to a public audience, will inform and change the minds of other people. And I want to tell you about an incident, an anecdote that happened to me when I was a very young activist. I became very friendly with a Jewish Israeli called Akiva Or. Now, Akiva Or was a communist, and he and some other communists like him had formed a small organization called Matzpen, which was anti-Zionist and anti the state of Israel. They were very, very early anti-Israel, Jewish anti-Zionists.
Mm-hmm.
Anyway, he became a very good friend. He was older than me, and I learned a lot of politics from him. I learned a lot about how to be a political operator from this Jewish Israeli, whom I remember with very great affection. Anyway, one day I went up and gave a talk to a group, and they're full of Zionist hecklers, and it was really distressing for me. I came away, he was there as well. I came away feeling and looking very dejected. And he said, "Don't feel like that. Listen to me. Regard your words, the things that you said, like a pebble thrown into a lake. You see how that pebble sets up circles, larger and larger circles. You never know what pebble, which of the pebbles that you said will do that. And later, much later, those people affected by the circles created by the pebble will become supporters of your point of view."
That's a beautiful. My cousin told me the same thing just recently listening to the podcast.
What a beautiful message to leave for our viewers and listeners from today's conversation. Are there any, before we conclude, Dr. Ghada, are there any other thoughts that you'd like to share? Anything we haven't covered that you'd like to say?
I don't think so. I think you've been very thorough, and also you've allowed me to say the thing that is really killing me, which is the impunity of this thing. Because actually, if I gave the parallel of the psychopathic killer, if nobody stops this killer, the killer will go on. It's very simple. So the question really, what motivates the people who allow it to happen? That's what we have to fight, you know?
Absolutely.
And as you said, Dr. Ghada, because Palestinians, people don't know us, but we're very kind, decent, generous, warm people. And we've been so dehumanized that people don't get to see that side of ours. And it's really important. And I think the Zionist ideology is so brutal and with a very detailed plan and process, whatever it takes. It's taken them 100 years and they still carry on, while we, on the other hand, have been very reactive, and because we've been traumatized and genocided against. So I think it's reversing that pattern is really important.
Yeah, I agree. You're quite right. Well, listen, you two are so articulate. I don't know why the hell you need to do a podcast with anybody.
No.
On the contrary, we have loved to hear it. I think it's always great to get different perspectives. So thank you so much for joining us today. We really enjoyed the talk.
Yeah, and just to add, Shamim, also it's important for us to showcase Palestinians, and because from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and so on, because people don't see that in the West.
No, that's true. Who do you anticipate will see this?
Well, we have a very big following from our films and Shamim's novels and so on. Right. Having said that, Shamim's Facebook with over 50,000 fans and her Instagram all got removed the minute we started the podcast, because we still have fans who are following us on other platforms. But yeah, that kind of silencing of voices and narrative has been a big clampdown, if you like.
Well, good for you. Honestly, I encourage you. Good luck.
Thank you so much. Thank you. And just to everybody who's joined us today, people-powered media is a good alternative to legacy-controlled media. If you enjoyed this episode, yes, please like and share and subscribe. That all makes a difference to the algorithm and to how we get seen. Your engagement definitely helps us to amplify voices like Dr. Ghada Karmi, voices that are dedicated to justice and humanism. Dr. Karmi, thank you again for your invaluable insights and your dedication to justice for Palestine and its people.
And thank you. And stories and representation matter. Stay informed, stay engaged, do take action. In solidarity, see you next time. And again, shukran, Dr. Ghada, for your voice, your tireless activism on Palestine. It's truly inspiring. Shukran.
Thank you.